Chapter 4, A Dance with the Devil. Before he came back to haunt her in the darkness of her apartment, before his knife plunged into her stomach, Alex Orrakeen had already danced her twisted waltz with him. His name was Vincent Mercer, a name that still sent shivers through her soul like the echo of a razor across skin. Theirs was a story written in blood, lust, and madness, a game of predator and prey where the lines were never clear. It had all started a year ago, in one of Edgewater's darker corners. The night was thick with the scent of rain and decay, the streets slick and gleaming under the bruised sky. Alex had been hunting, prowling through the city's veins like a cancer, searching for her next victim. She was restless, her hunger for death gnawing at her insides like a starving beast. But that night, it wasn't just the blood she craved. It was something more, something primal that made her skin itch and her heart race. That's when she heard him. His voice cut through the noise of the city like a blade, smooth and rich, dripping with confidence. He was standing at the bar in the Black Lantern, the kind of dive where people went to lose themselves in cheap liquor and darker urges. She could hear the rhythmic clink of ice cubes in his glass, the deep rumble of his laugh, a sound that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She was blind, but she didn't need eyes to see him. She could feel him, a dark, magnetic presence that drew her in like a moth to a flame. He wasn't like the other men she'd killed, the ones who stank of desperation and fear. No, Vincent was different. There was an air of danger about him, something that both thrilled and terrified her. For the first time, she felt like she was the one being hunted. "Alex," he murmured, as if her name were a secret he'd plucked from the air. He was beside her before she could react, his breath warm against her ear, the scent of whiskey on his lips. "You look like a woman who enjoys games." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile. "And what kind of game did you have in mind?" "The kind where we see who's the better monster," he replied, his voice a low growl that sent heat pooling between her thighs. There was something in the way he spoke, the way his fingers brushed against her arm, that made her want to tear him apart. But instead, she played along. For once, she was curious. Their relationship, if one could even call it that, began that night, in a frenzy of teeth, nails, and blood. He took her back to his apartment, a place that smelled of leather, sweat, and something darker she couldn't quite name. There was no tenderness, no whispered promises. Just raw, brutal passion. He didn't treat her like she was fragile, didn't handle her as if she might break. He knew she was dangerous, and he loved it. The sex was violent, a collision of flesh and pain that left them both gasping, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. It wasn't long before she discovered his tastes ran just as dark as hers. He would trace her scars with a cruel tenderness, biting at her throat hard enough to draw blood, whispering things in her ear that sent her spiraling into a place where pain and pleasure were indistinguishable. "I know what you are," he would murmur against her skin, his voice soft and teasing. "I see through the pretty mask you wear." And somehow, that only made her crave him more. He became her addiction, her sickness. For weeks, they played their game, each trying to outdo the other, testing limits, pushing boundaries. There was no love, no affection, just the shared thrill of violence and death. He was a killer, just like her, and together they left a trail of bodies that painted the city red. But as the bodies piled up, so did the tension between them. Vincent's games became crueler, his need for control more insistent. He would disappear for days, leaving her alone in her darkness, the whispers in her head growing louder with every passing hour. And when he returned, he would drag her into the depths of depravity, pushing her further than she had ever gone before. Then, one night, everything changed. It was supposed to be a simple kill, a lonely businessman Vincent had lured into their trap. But something had shifted in him. His eyes, which she couldn't see but could feel burning into her, were wild, feverish. He didn't want to kill this one quickly. He wanted to make him suffer, to make Alex watch as he peeled the man apart piece by piece. "Is this what you want?" Vincent asked, his voice cold, detached, as if he were discussing the weather. He drove the knife into the man's shoulder, twisting it slowly. The man's screams filled the air, thick with agony, but Alex found herself repulsed. For the first time, she hesitated. The thrill was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that clawed at her insides. She had never cared for the suffering of her victims, but now, watching Vincent, she realized something terrifying. She had become his puppet, dancing to the tune of his madness. Vincent noticed her hesitation. His laughter was low, mocking. "What's the matter, darling? Losing your edge?" "No," she snapped, her voice tight with fury. But the doubt was already there, gnawing at her like a cancer. She had always been the one in control, the one who decided when the game ended. But now, Vincent was the one holding the strings, and she was the one dancing to his twisted melody. That's when she decided he had to die. She planned it meticulously, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She lured him back to her apartment with promises of blood and flesh, her smile sweet, her touch gentle. But beneath the surface, her mind was a storm of rage and betrayal. When he walked through her door that night, she could sense his arrogance, his belief that she was still under his spell. He kissed her roughly, biting her lip until it bled, and she let him, pretending to submit. But as he undressed, she reached for the knife hidden beneath her mattress. He was on top of her, his hands around her throat, squeezing just enough to make her gasp for air. But this time, she wasn't afraid. As he leaned down to kiss her, she drove the knife into his side, her face twisting with satisfaction as she felt the blade pierce his flesh. The look on his face was one of pure shock. "You, bitch," he gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. But she didn't stop. She drove the knife in again and again, relishing the way his body convulsed beneath her, his strength ebbing with each strike. But Vincent was a fighter, just like her. With the last of his strength, he ripped the knife from her hands and drove it into her thigh. Pain exploded through her, but she didn't stop, didn't let go. She wrapped her hands around his throat, squeezing until she felt the life drain out of him. As his body went limp, she lay there, panting, her hands slick with his blood. She had won. She had taken back control. Or so she thought. But she should have known better. Monsters like Vincent never stayed dead. And now, as she lay bleeding on the floor of her bathroom, his knife buried in her stomach, she realized that their game was far from over.